of the program.
Morning, David.
So can you just clear this up for us? Will the coalition scrap Australia's 2030 climate target?
Well, what we've done is state the obvious, David, which is the 2030 target's not going to be met. It's not going to happen. And so what Peter Dutton is saying is the truth. If you look at the actual emissions under Labor, David, they have not declined. When the government came to office in June 2022, 108 million tonnes of emissions in that quarter. March 2024, 108 million tonnes of emissions. They're not on target to meet this forecast. And of course, this is the same guy, Chris Bowen, who forecast that electricity prices would come down by $275 per family. And so we're not going to just blindly accept a forecast that's obviously wrong.
Let's come back to the question, though. Will the coalition scrap the 2030 target?
Well, look, we'll have more to say about targets before the election. But
so
Peter Dutton,
might have a different 2030 target?
Well, Peter Dutton made very clear on Saturday that that target is not going to be met, and we're not going to just, because Chris Bowen has named a target, say, well, you know, that target is going to happen, because plainly it's not going to happen.
The department says it will, but just coming back to your position, you might still have a 2030 target.
Well, just to pull you up on that, the department doesn't say it will, David. It says that it will be missed, and it also says...
Well, it says 42% will be achieved.
Well, and it bases that on information that Chris Bowen has given to the department about policies that have not yet been implemented.
Okay. But what about just this question? Will you have a 2030 target?
Well, look, as I said, we'll make all of our policies very clear well in advance of the election. We are absolutely committed to net zero by 2050.
So this
it's
is
incredibly
a little confusing.
important.
You might have, it sounds like you're saying, you're leaving open the prospect of having a 2030 target.
Well, David, we will make all of our policies very clear in relation to emissions. We are absolutely committed to the net zero target by 2050. We are absolutely committed to the Paris Agreement. But we're not going to maintain a Chris Bowen fantasy when it's plainly not going to happen. Why would we do that?
Has the party room even discussed this?
Well, look, I'm not going to go into our internal party room discussions, David. But
sort of thing you should discuss, though, right?
Well, look, what Peter Dutton said, David, is Chris Bowen is not going to meet the target that he set. That is true. And what's the counterfactual, David? Is Peter Dutton and the coalition supposed to maintain a Chris Bowen fantasy because it's convenient for Chris Bowen?
Well,
no.
at least tell us whether you think we should have a target at all. Would be a starting point, wouldn't it?
Well, again, David, we'll make all of our targets very clear prior to the election. We are very committed to net zero and to Paris, the Paris Agreement.
So you want to stay in Paris?
We absolutely are committed to the Paris Agreement.
The agreement says you can't water down targets. You do need to have a 2030 and a 2035 target.
Well, David, the question on the 2030 target is really one for Chris Bowen. He's the one who's parading around a target that is not going to happen. There have been basically no emissions reductions in the 2 years that Labor has been in office, which I would have thought was a pretty pertinent fact if we're talking about emissions reductions.
All right, I'll move on, but just to be clear, you reckon you can stay in the Paris Agreement maybe without a 2030 target?
We're committed to the Paris Agreement, we're committed to net zero by 2050, and we'll have more to say about targets well in advance of the election.
Let's turn to social media. The e-safety commissioner dropped the case against X during the week. This was in relation to the video about the Wakely stabbing and whether it should have been taken down from the Twitter servers globally. The case is now done. From a policy perspective, this is still a bit of a question. Should the commissioner, the e-safety commissioner in Australia, have the power to order social media companies to remove content globally?
Well, look, what the Commissioner was really doing is saying that the easiest way to remove material for Australians is simply to delete it. The Act is very clear. It's for Australian users, not global users. And so what the court case was effectively about is how do you define an Australian user online? And that's what the interim judgment was about. But the Commissioner has had pretty much all the other platforms deleted the material, and she wanted to test that in court.
But she also said this week, now able to talk about it, Julian McGrant, the Commissioner, said that when the coalition government gave her the powers, it was very clear, it was in a press release, she said, the power to order content be removed wherever it's hosted, and they're usually hosted in the United States. So she says that's what you guys told her to do.
Yeah, no, and she's right. And I don't think that's not in dispute, David. So the Act is very clear that the Commissioner's orders can apply to remove content that's hosted overseas.
Right, because it's confused. Peter Dutton said when she did this that you can't influence what happens elsewhere in the world. I think it's silly to try that.
They're separate issues, David. So the servers are located overseas, but what the Act is about is Australian users. So in order to stop the content from being seen by Australian users, you've got to take action on those overseas servers. And actually, X didn't dispute that. Right. What X disputed was, should that apply to users who are outside of Australia? And that's what the court case was about. And Peter was just stating the obvious, that just as we wouldn't want Romania to regulate for our internet, we can't regulate for Romania. And the Commissioner's not saying that she wants to do that. It was just a debate about how you define an Australian user online.
Do you think the Commissioner's confused about her powers here?
No. I think the Commissioner does a great job.
So she wasn't silly to try and do this?
Well, look, again, David, she was simply testing the legal issue around the definition of an Australian user. She wasn't seeking to claim global domain over the internet. And we appointed Julian Mangran, and of course she was pursuing laws under the Online Safety Act, the world-leading Online Safety Act that the Coalition put in place.
More broadly on social media, you do have great concerns about the impact that it's having, particularly on young people. Just explain to me what your concerns are and what needs to be done.
Yeah, David, I think this is one of the defining issues of our era. I think that the mental health of Australian kids is being massively damaged by social media. If you look at things like the self-harm hospitalisation rates of girls, it's a heavy topic, David, but we should talk about it, up dramatically in the last decade. There's no question in my mind that social media is playing a part in that. And the social media companies basically don't do anything about it, is the bottom line. And so what we need to do is put in place a system of age verification where we basically say, if you're under this age, you shouldn't be on social media, and we put the onus on the social media companies to actually enforce that, as opposed to what they do now, which is pretty much nothing. And
so, I mean, we can come to technically how that would work, but in principle, you're saying at what age should kids not be on social media?
Yeah, well, look, we've said we don't really see why kids under 16 need to be on social media, but we'll have more to say about that in the future.
But is it fair to say that the Coalition is essentially arguing kids under 16 you would like to ban from social media?
Well, look, we've said we don't see why kids under 16 should be on social media, David. Different people have different views on the age, but bottom line is, little kids should not be on social media. We still have a classification system. We still have R-rated movies. Nobody says, hey, let's show an R-rated movie to a 10-year-old. And yet on social media, they see worse things every day. And imagine, David, if we went back 20 years and we said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to create an environment where kids can interact with any adult on earth who can show them whatever they want, and we're going to be okay with that. We would have said that's absurd, and it's time to take action on that.
Clearly, a lot of parents would agree. How you do it, though, this age verification technology now being trialled, just give us a sense of where you would like to get to with this in terms of making it legally enforceable.
Yeah, well, look, on the trial, so we put legislation to Parliament in November to get started on trialling this. The government came into the Parliament and voted against it. 6 months later, they changed their mind. But what's happening with this trial now, David, is social media companies are not required to actually do anything in the trial, which is absurd. So what should be happening is the government should be saying to the social media companies, under the trial, you need at your front door, when kids try to sign up, you need a process of age verification. Now, if the government needs further powers or laws to do that, we'll wave them through. But what they're saying at the moment is the trial won't require the social media companies to do anything, which is plainly absurd. So that's what we want to see.
And of course, plenty of people point out that kids are pretty clever with technology, whether it's VPNs or whatever. There are ways to get around the technology, ways for them to still use social media.
Well, it's true that people will try to get around whatever law you put in place, David, but that's true of just about every law. We don't say, some people might try and, traffic illegal material, so therefore we won't have a law to stop it. So we have to say, what do we want as a society? And what we should want as a society is to protect kids from the immense damage that's being done to them through social media. So that's the first point. So we should all come together and say, we're going to do this. And then you get into the implementation questions. And will someone try to get around it? Yeah, they will. But that is not a reason not to do it.
And if not enough is done over the next little while before the election, you'll go to the election saying, we want to ban kids under 16 from social media.
Well, look, we think it is self-evident that action needs to be taken here. The government has, frankly, been well behind the eight ball here. There's been a lot of campaigning from the coalition in the community. I met last week with some families of people who are advocating this change, and many of whom have been through the most tragic of circumstances. And we've got to get this done, and the government is moving too slowly. It shouldn't be a partisan thing, it's just self-evident, but we should just get on and do it.
Let me turn to a couple of other issues. Your seat of Banks in Sydney has one of the highest, if not the highest, proportion of people with Chinese ancestry. I think it's something like 20%. In your inaugural speech in Parliament, you said Australia made its national foundations stronger by allowing more people to build upon them. Are you comfortable with your party's plans to dramatically slash immigration?
I'm very comfortable with those plans, David. We have to cut immigration because the government completely lost control of it. 920,000 people in 2 years, and during the period got the forecasts wrong by literally hundreds of thousands. My experience, David, is that people, regardless of their background, and in many cases, particularly people of multicultural backgrounds who have moved to Australia, everyone wants an orderly system. Everyone wants an immigration system where if you play by the rules, if you work hard, you're rewarded. But people don't want a random system that's out of control, and that's what we've got at the moment.
And does the plan involve cutting family reunion visas by 25% as well?
Well, look, we'll put forward all those numbers down the track. Obviously, as you know...
You're not sure at the moment, or...?
Well, David, as you know, the government hasn't said for itself for the
No, I'm asking
future.
about your policy. Is it to cut family reunion visas?
Well, look, as Dan Tians said previously, David, we'll review the economic situation when we come to government, and we'll make appropriate decisions at that time. And
How
the
would
government
that go down in your seat?
Well, I think, again, David, people are sensible, in my experience, about migration. They want an orderly system. They want someone in charge who's actually got their hands on the levers, and not someone who's just, frankly, losing control, which is what's happened under this government.
Final issue, the immigration minister's issued a new direction 110, as to when you can cancel someone's visa. Peter Dutton says any non-citizen who's committed a serious offence should be kicked out. What if they have children in Australia, though? Should that be taken into consideration?
Well, again, David, I mean, the bottom line here is that Andrew Giles has let criminals stay in Australia deliberately. So the whole purpose of Direction 99 was to ensure that people who would other go to New Zealand don't. New Zealand said, please keep your criminals in Australia, and Australia said, where do I sign? Which was extraordinary. And what Peter's saying is, of course, we want to drive down to zero the number of criminals who are staying in Australia, because plainly that's not in Australia's interest.
Well, you had a ministerial direction when you were Immigration Minister as well. This was Direction 79, and it said decision makers must make a determination about whether cancellation is or is not in the best interests of the child. And that was a primary consideration in your direction. It was then used to let various people stay in Australia, including the disgraced former basketball star Kendall Pinder. He was convicted of various sexual assaults. The AAT let him stay in Australia. He went on to rape again. He pleaded guilty to 2 more rapes. Andrew Giles finally cancelled his visa a few months ago. Why didn't you cancel his visa?
Well, David, and obviously I'm not familiar with that particular case.
Made a lot of headlines.
What I did in Direction 79, David, that you just referred to, is actually strengthen the system by increasing the emphasis on crimes related to violence against women and children. So I strengthened the system.
Yeah, but you also said their kids should be a primary consideration. If they've got kids here, that needs to be a primary consideration.
Well, and that's been a consideration in the system for a very long time, David. But
it let a sex offender stay, and he went on to re-offend. So do you take responsibility for that?
Well, David, what I did was strengthen the system in Direction 79. It was stronger than previous directions. What Andrew Giles did was explicitly weaken the system.
No, but I'm asking about your direction, which the AAT cited in a number of cases. I've got one here of a heroin trafficker as well, allowed to stay, citing your Direction 79. Do you not take responsibility for that?
Well, David, again, I'm not familiar with the specific examples.
Your direction.
Well, I'm not familiar with the specific cases you're referring to, but Direction 79 was stronger than the directions that preceded it. Direction 99 was deliberately weaker than the directions that preceded it.
Because you're not aware of this case, Kendall Pinder, you can Google him, you're not taking responsibility?
Well, David, there are obviously large numbers of cases that go through the system every year. And what you do as a minister, and what I did as a minister, was seek to strengthen the system, was seek to make it harder.
This guy was
for
allowed
criminals
to stay. Andrew Giles had to kick him out.
Well, David, again, what I did was make the system stronger. There are always constitutional and legal reasons that affect particular cases. Well, I don't agree with that at all, David, because I made it stronger. That's the decision I made. The decision Andrew Giles made was, how do we ensure that people who would otherwise go back to New Zealand get to stay in Australia? And that was a shameful decision. And that's why he sought to reverse it in Direction 110, but he still kept the connection to the Australian community as a primary consideration, which is the whole problem with Direction 99 in the first place. These guys have no idea how to manage the immigration system, and that's why we've seen such terrible results.
David Coleman, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David.